Hey everyone, welcome back to Learner's World. Today's video is over 9/11 and today is the anniversary of 9/11. I'll have a fill-in-the-blank note sheet and a Quizlet linked in the description box below, so without further ado, let's get started. Starting off with what was behind the 9/11 attacks, there were 19 hijackers who were part of Al-Qaeda that carried out these attacks. Al-Qaeda's motives for the attacks included Western support for attacking Muslims in Somalia, supporting Russian atrocities against Muslims in Chechnya, supporting the Indian oppression against Muslims in Kashmir, among other reasons. So now I'm going to kind of go over the timeline of events that took place on 9/11. Starting off with at 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 with 92 people aboard took off from Boston's Logan International Airport en route to Los Angeles. At 8:14 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 with 65 people aboard takes off from Boston, also headed to Los Angeles. At 8:19 a.m., flight attendants aboard Flight 11 alerted ground personnel that the plane had been hijacked. American Airlines in turn notified the FBI. At 8:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 takes off from Dulles International Airport outside of Washington, D.C., headed to Los Angeles with 64 people on board. At 8:24 a.m., hijacker Mohammed Atta makes the first of two accidental transmissions from Flight 11 to ground control. At 8:40 a.m., air traffic controllers at the FAA, or Federal Aviation Administration, alerted the North American Defense Command, abbreviated to NORAD's Northeast Air Defense Sector, abbreviated to NEADS, about the suspected hijacking of Flight 11. In response, NEADS, located at Cape Cod's Otis Air National Guard Base, worked to locate and tail Flight 11. They were not yet in the air when Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower. So NEADS did scramble two fighter planes from Cape Cod's Air National Guard Base. At 8:41 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 with 44 people on board took off from Newark International Airport en route to San Francisco, though it had been scheduled to depart at 8 a.m. around the same time as the other hijacked planes. At 8:46 a.m., Mohammed Atta and the other hijackers aboard American Airlines Flight 11 crashed the plane into the floors 93 to 99 of the North Tower of the World Trade Center, killing everyone on board and hundreds inside the building. At 8:47 a.m., within seconds, NYPD and FDNY forces dispatched units to the World Trade Center, while Port Authority Police Department officers on site began immediate evacuation of the North Tower. At 8:50 a.m., White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card alerted President George W. Bush that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. The president was visiting an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida at the time. At 9:02 a.m., after initially instructing tenants of the World Trade Center South Tower to remain in the building, Port Authority officials broadcast orders to evacuate both towers via the public address system. An estimated 10,000 to 14,000 people were already in the process of evacuating. At 9:03 a.m., hijackers crashed United Airlines Flight 175 into floors 75 to 85 of the World Trade Center South Tower, killing everyone on board and hundreds inside the building. At 9:08 a.m., the FAA bans all takeoff flights going to New York City or through the airspace around the city. At 9:21 a.m., the Port Authority closed all bridges and tunnels in the New York City area. At 9:24 a.m., the FAA notified NEADS of the suspected hijacking of Flight 77 after some passengers and crew aboard were able to alert family members on the ground. At 9:31 a.m., speaking from Florida, President Bush called the events of New York City an apparent terrorist attack. At 9:37 a.m., hijackers aboard Flight 77 crashed the plane into the western facade of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., which killed 59 people aboard the plane and 125 military and civilian personnel inside the building. At 9:42 a.m., for the first time in history, the FAA grounded all flights over or bound for the continental U.S. Over the next 2.5 hours, some 3,300 commercial flights and 1,200 private planes are guided to land at airports in Canada and the United States. At 9:45 a.m., amid rumors of the attacks on the White House and U.S. Capitol, the buildings were evacuated. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. At 10:07 a.m., after passengers and crew members aboard the hijacked Flight 93 contact friends and family and learn about the attacks in New York City and Washington, they mount and attempt to retake the plane. In response, hijackers deliberately crashed the plane into a field, Somerset County, Pennsylvania, killing all 40 passengers and crew aboard. 10:28 a.m. is when the North Tower collapsed, just 102 minutes after being struck by Flight 11. At 11 a.m., Mayor Rudolph Giuliani calls for the evacuation of Lower Manhattan, south of Canal Street, including more than 1 million residents, workers, and tourists, as efforts continue throughout the afternoon to search for survivors at the World Trade Center site. At 1 p.m. at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, President Bush announced that U.S. military forces are on high alert worldwide. At 2:51 a.m., the U.S. Navy dispatched missile destroyers to New York City and Washington, D.C. At 5:20 p.m., the 47-story 7 World Trade Center collapsed after burning for hours. The building had been evacuated in the morning, and there were no casualties, though the collapse forced rescue workers to flee for their lives. It was the last of the Twin Towers to fall. At 6:58 p.m., President Bush returned to the White House after stops at military bases in Louisiana and Nebraska. So, what were the targets? The targets were the North and South Towers of the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and United Airlines Flight 93. What were the repercussions of 9/11? So, the repercussions were policymakers with a strong desire to prevent similar events assess the existing security and vulnerabilities in the country's infrastructure. In response to any threat, engineers would have to make buildings more secure and resistant to external threats. 9/11 proved to be an opening act of the global war against terrorism. Counterterrorism since 9/11. Since 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security has been created. The Department of Homeland Security and its many partners in the federal government, private and public sectors, and communities across the country and across the world have worked to build a new Homeland Security enterprise in order to better mitigate and defend against threats, minimize risk, and maximize the ability to respond and recover from all sorts of threats and disasters. Memorializing 9/11. To memorialize 9/11, there are several permanent, public, and accessible locations. These locations include the National September 11 Memorial and Museum in New York City, the Pentagon Memorial, and the Flight 93 National Memorial, all of which I have pictures on the slide to show. American anxiety after 9/11. Anxiety manifested as widespread fear, increased rate of mental health disorders, and a decreased sense of security. Many started to view the country as vulnerable and as opposed to being invincible. Health issues dealt with by survivors and first responders on 9/11. So mental health-wise, studies conducted after 9/11 suggest that those who experienced the attacks and watched the attacks via the news are at a greater risk of developing long-term psychological effects, PTSD being the most common, with 20% of survivors displaying symptoms. 15% of survivors display depression symptoms, and 10% reported PTSD and depression symptoms. So there were some respiratory conditions dealt with. Many surviving first responders reported severe persistent cough. Findings also showed increasing rates of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, among those exposed at the World Trade Center site, and some may also deal with asthma and sinusitis. So sinusitis is a condition in which tissue lining the sinuses becomes swollen or inflamed. Other health conditions dealt with are GERD, which is the abbreviation of gastroesophageal reflux disorder. GERD is a condition in which stomach contents leak backwards from the stomach into the esophagus. And there's also different types of cancers being dealt with as well. Frequently asked questions about 9/11. What does Afghanistan have to do with 9/11? Al-Qaeda was based in Afghanistan. Located in Afghanistan were their training camps, and they openly lived in the country with the support of the Taliban. So the Taliban is an Islamist group that ruled the country. What countries did the terrorists come from? 15 of the 19 were from Saudi Arabia. 1 was from Lebanon, 1 was from Egypt, and 2 were from the United Arab Emirates. What were the Twin Towers? These were the tallest buildings in New York City. Each one stood at 110 stories each. They provided nearly 10 million square feet of office space for about 35,000 people and 430 companies. Roughly 70,000 commuters and tourists were attracted daily. That's all I have for today's video. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please hit the like button, and if there's a topic you want to learn more about in the future, please leave it in the comment section below. Hope you'll have a great day. Bye!